In case you didn't check with the website on the topic of tonight's talk, and to give you a chance to leave now if you want to, it's about hatred, ill will, fear, all those things that we tend to be somewhat averse to. A couple of weeks ago, we initiated a series of talks on these three unwholesome roots or poisons, as they're sometimes called. And so this is the second one, in case you weren't here last week or 2 weeks ago when we began with Jean's talk. So just a couple of lines about these three unwholesome roots. There is no fire hotter than the fire of greed, no ice colder than the ice of hatred, no fog thicker than the fog of ignorance. So again, they're called the three poisons in some traditions and the unwholesome roots of suffering in the Theravadan tradition. And our intention in looking at these one by one for 3 weeks is really to try to understand them a bit more, perhaps, and then how we work with them. How do we be with these? How do we work to ease the suffering with each of these? And tonight's topic, as I said, is ill will, hatred, anger. Take your choice. But I want to back up and start with the first noble truth, the premise that there is suffering, there is dukkha or unsatisfactoriness. Because often we tend to skip over that one and we move right into the others. And it may be because this is a hard place to really pause and take in the fact that there is suffering. We know there's suffering, yes, and our tendency may be to slide past that as quickly as possible. And just as a reminder of what dukkha is, one person has described it as the psychological experience, sometimes conscious, sometimes not, of the profound fact that everything is impermanent, ungraspable, and not really knowable. So on some level we understand that. All the things that we have, we don't really have. All the things that we see, we're not really seeing entirely. This is the nature of things, and yet we tend to think the opposite. Because our mind has been conditioned by ignorance into thinking that happiness can be obtained through things that are, in essence, ephemeral and transient. We have a tendency to think that we can know and own our lives, our loves, our identities, or even our possessions. But the gap between the reality and the basic human approach to life is suffering. It's an experience for many of a kind of a basic anxiety or frustration with what is. And in this, the untrained mind can't find a place to sit back and enjoy without some degree of fear or worry. It's important to remember, however, that the Buddha's message, if we think it's the fact that all things are impermanent or non-substantial or without a solid self, these basic facts aren't the truth about the origin of suffering. The Buddha taught that the suffering comes from the clinging to or the attachment to these beliefs. So it's attachment to this, aversion to that, ignorance of all else. That's the cause of the suffering. And there's a great continuum, so there can be a sort of vague unsettledness at one end of the continuum to deep agony at the other end. But anytime there's pain of any kind, whether it's physical pain in the body, the pain of aggression, of grieving, of loss, irritation, resentment, jealousy, if you really look into it, what we discover is that behind the pain, there's something we're attached to, or something we really don't want, something that we hate. And sometimes we are averse to even acknowledging fully these unwholesome roots, just naming them, clinging, hatred, delusion, might cause us to cringe. And this was brought up last week when we talked a bit about it after Jeff's talk. One way to consider these three is to see them as the energy of the ego. The ego's three basic attitudes of for me, against me, or don't care. So clinging, greed, whatever feels good, we want a little more of that. Because ultimately the ego is attached to whatever ensures its survival, physically, psychologically, spiritually. And tonight's focus on hatred, ill will, we try to repel anything that we believe will hurt or threaten us in some way. And because we're actually willing to hurt others to protect ourselves, even on a massive scale, think war, think of racism, anti-Semitism, classism, this hateful aggression is a boundless cause of suffering. And the third one, which we'll talk about next week, ignorance or delusion, if you're not for me or against me, you don't matter. So this is often what enables people to prioritize their own pleasure over the suffering of billions of others. And again, think climate change. Think resource allocation. Think justice. Mark Epstein says, the basic idea is that certain powerful reactions have the capacity to take hold of us and drive our behavior. We believe in these reactions more than we believe in anything else, and they become the means by which we both hide from ourselves and we attempt to cope with a world of ceaseless change and unpredictability. The problem with the ego is that it wants so badly to know. It comes into being when we're 2, 3 years old, 4 years old, just beginning to feel our own sense of separateness. And we see how difficult it is to navigate the external pressures from parents, teachers, and the internal pressures of our own biology, our drives. So the ego wants security, it wants stability, coherence. And it's rooted in the intellect, so it tells stories. And it fastens onto the first stories that start to make sense for us, both positive and negative. And you can think about that for a moment, just reflecting on some early stories from your own childhood, those that are positive and negative, the ways in which we have a tendency to believe them based on our conditioning. So a classic stubborn story dealt with in therapy, those of you who are therapists can perhaps identify with this, can be summarized in 4 words. The problem is me. The problem is me. And of course, the resulting low self-esteem from the repetition of those stories is reinforced. So pause for a moment right now and just close your eyes and take a breath. Just notice what's rising in your body, in your mind. A sense of opening or a sense of closing. Curiosity or aversion. Not judging any of it, just aware of what's present. So opening the eyes, and to say a little bit more about this focus tonight on this root of hatred or ill will, just to say that this includes so many other things, anger, jealousy, resentment, judgment, boredom, all examples of aversion. So here's what the Buddha had to say about the three roots of what is unskillful. Greed is a root of what is unskillful. Aversion is a root of what is unskillful. Delusion is a root of what is unskillful. And he goes on to say, aversion itself is unskillful. Whatever an aversive person fabricates by means of body, speech, or intellect, that too is unskillful. So whatever an aversive person fabricates by means of body, speech, or intellect, that too is unskillful. And in addition to that, he says, whatever suffering an aversive person, her mind overcome with aversion, his mind consumed, wrongly inflicts on another person through beating or imprisonment or confiscation or placing blame or banishment with the thought, I have power or I want power, that too is unskillful. Thus it is that many unskillful qualities born of aversion, caused by aversion, originated through aversion, conditioned by aversion, come into play. It's a long, complicated sentence. So maybe the question arises, well, how does aversion arise? Born of aversion, caused by aversion, conditioned by aversion. It's helpful at this point to remember how the mind works, how the mind and brain work. So you may remember the neurological steps. The Buddha terms them the 5 aggregates of how our experience actually works. So to begin with, there's form, there's a sound, there's a something seen, something heard, something tasted. The sense consciousness, the door is open and something comes into form. And these follow so quickly, one upon another. We're going to talk about them separately, but think of them as coming right on top of one another. The second one is feeling tone, called Vedana. And this is when the awareness of a form, sound, a shape, whatever we're aware of, a thought, engenders a feeling. So the feeling tone would be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral if we're unaware of it. With those two happening, form, feeling tone, perception, this is a quilt, this is a light, this is the air conditioning. We're aware of a thought about form and feeling tone. And then the next layer comes in very, very quickly, which is our conditioning, if you will, some sort of a mental formation, an assessment, a decision, a judgment, an opinion, something layered right there next to it, again, based on our living, our conditioning, our childhood experiences. So I'm angry, I hate, this is painful, this is a huge loss, I feel criticized, whatever. That is the mental formation that occurs in the moment. And the final one, consciousness, is I'll read you this sentence. Consciousness is a series of episodic events flashing again and again as phenomena are cognized for an exceptional instant before they vanish, never again to reappear in exactly the same way. So these 5 are occurring relatively simultaneously, and part of our practice is to slow down enough to begin to just see the arising of feeling tone, for example. Can you actually detect the leaning towards something pleasant, the leaning away from something that's unpleasant? Can you see the thought, the conditioning, the mental formation come in on top of that, with that? So if we understand how something works in the brain and the mind, this helps to promote a little bit of trust or conviction about this process. Just knowing the components of an experience makes it a little easier to see the essential truth about life itself. For an example, when we're aware of perception occurring, and we see an email come in from somebody that we have a little bit of a trying relationship with, let's say, we can see the mental formations arising. Oh, not him again. Or, what am I going to do with this one? Or, can I just ignore this, pretend it didn't come in today? So they remind us that there's also a strong feeling state happening here, very strong, pleasant or unpleasant, in this case unpleasant. This is painful, worry is known. But somewhere in here we don't have to exhaust ourselves with postures of denial or pretense. We can actually acknowledge, oh, this is painful. And we also begin to see that my difficulties, in this case with this email with the trying person, they're not necessarily a personal drama. It's just how it is right now, given causes and conditions. So we could even extrapolate a bit and say, this is the human experience of frustration or anger. And acknowledge the full gamut of it. See it for what it is. Let it fill the space. Let it be here if we can. When we open to suffering and we see the roots of it, it becomes a little bit easier to see what actions we might take to ease the suffering. So it's not as though there's some magical endpoint or goal that we're after, but there is a way in which we move in that direction to experience whatever's here right now. And of course, there are lots of times where we can't change the end of the story. We can't make all the suffering go away. But the outcome might shift as we relate to the truth before us with some awareness, with some compassion for ourselves. And this is the teaching of the Buddha, that the truth of suffering is also the path to the end of suffering. So if hatred is unwholesome, what's skillful? So here's what the Buddha said. And you can see what your response to these ideas, what is your response to these ideas? Lack of aversion itself is skillful. So he's not even giving us another word. He says just the lack of aversion. The lack of aversion. And sometimes we feel the mind going after, what does he really mean? What is the lack of aversion? Whatever an unaverse person, are you unaverse right now? Whatever an unaverse person fabricates by means of body, speech, or intellect, that too is skillful. Whatever suffering an unaverse person, his mind not overcome with greed, her mind not consumed, does not wrongly inflict on another person through beating or imprisonment or confiscation or placing blame or banishment, that too is skillful. Thus it is that many skillful qualities born of a lack of aversion, caused by lack of aversion, originated through lack of aversion, conditioned by lack of aversion, come into play. So what are those skillful qualities born of lack of aversion? Well, one might be equanimity. And going back to that notion of how it is we experience life and what the five aggregates are, we see that equanimity can break the chain between, for example, the feeling, tone, and aversion. So if you catch yourself saying, "Oh, this is unpleasant," and acknowledging that unpleasantness, whatever it is, it may keep us from moving into a reactive pattern, a habitual pattern, the email that comes in that we don't want. Rick Hansen has a way of framing this. He says, does everybody know what a mudroom is? A mudroom? A mudroom is a space, mudroom is that space you come into that's not fully in your house where you shed all your garments. If you ever lived up north, you had a mudroom, most likely. You shed the outer garments before you enter your living room. Rick Hansen says, you let the feeling tone just be. It gets into the mud room of your mind, that outer room where the muddy boots and the wet jackets get left, but it doesn't enter the central living room of your mind. We recognize the clinging, the aversion, the hatred, the anger, whatever's there, but we choose not to be drawn in by it. Equanimity allows us to just be present with the pleasant, the unpleasant, the neutral, without getting reactivated around them. And when we're not activated, our natural resting state, which no doubt all of us probably wish we had a little bit more of, is characterized by calm, contentedness, caring, and creativity. Remember, however, that historically we are especially vulnerable to signals of threat because in evolution it was central for our survival, our existence. So from a survival viewpoint, it's more important to dodge a missile than to get a carrot. If you miss the carrot, no big deal. It'll come around tomorrow maybe. If you miss the missile, it's over. So because of this wiring towards really noticing anything threatening, it makes it a little bit more difficult. Sometimes it makes aversion a very strong phenomena in our lives in an effort to stay safe. When we're equanimous, when we're not activated, those reactions stay in the mudroom. And to some degree, what that does is create greater spaciousness in the living room because it's not crowded by the aversion, the hatred, the anger. And yes, certainly we prefer the pleasant to continue, the unpleasant to end. That's okay. But we don't react to not getting that preference. We just surround it with some space. And that's where there's some freedom. So one of the keys here is pausing long enough to see reactivity, to see what's actually happening. Can we be mindful of feeling tone, of pleasant or unpleasant, mindfulness of thoughts arising? Being angry is being angry. And after a while we can say, and so what? With that tone of voice. So what? It's like this now. Sounds easy. But we recognize that anger, hatred, ill will are powerful and sometimes long held. So how else might we work with this unwholesome root of suffering? It's been suggested that one way out is not to deny the three poisons, but to recognize if you turn them around, you come to their opposites. Instead of greed, you have generosity. Instead of anger, you have kindness, compassion. Instead of ignorance, you have wisdom. So if you're angry with someone, what would it be like to hold them in your heart with loving kindness, with compassion? If you're angry with yourself, what would it be like to do the same? Anger isn't always easy to recognize. Sometimes it's disguised as numbness or depression or helplessness or fear. So part of the practice is to begin to become familiar with what's arising so that we can discern, what's at the root here, what's beneath, what's being seen. By applying mindfulness to moments of anger, you can begin to see anger as it's arising, and you're seeing the tracings of what its effects are. As you continue to stay present to the anger, and again, it's helpful to maybe use a phrase like, this is the human experience of anger. You realize that the anger is not me, it's not mine, it's just a state of mine, like the weather, and it's going to change before too long. This weather's not going to last out here. I had a poem about winter and cold and snow for you tonight. It didn't work. So instead I went to my yard and picked hellebores blossoms and brought them in, and they're so pretty. They're probably blooming in some of your yards. So recognizing that anger, like the weather, is going to change, it can release us from a kind of prison, being stuck with it. You can feel anger, and it's justified at times it's not. But if it's justified, you've got a couple of possibilities. You can either do something about it or not. And you don't need melodrama, which simply multiplies your suffering. You can act to right the wrong that you perceive that's provoked your anger. If you can't do that, you can still speak your truth. So Philip Moffitt says, it's the identifying with the anger that's the problem. It's when we get caught in it, we're stuck with it. Rather than judging yourself for being angry, be interested in how you might skillfully use it to motivate yourself or others. Anger is simply energy. If you can disidentify with the anger, it can give you some courage to take action. And if you bring mindfulness to the anger, it might eventually become clear whether or not the anger is justified. And we know this probably from looking at places in our lives where anger tends to arise frequently. In the meantime, this is really important. In the meantime, you treat yourself and the other with kindness, as kindly as possible. Ironically, that will create more space for the mindfulness to be present. The anger's already there, so don't get angry with yourself for being angry. We've done that too, right? Layered it on. You might also try renunciation, which is something else, a word that's for some can cause a little cringing. Renounce? I have to renounce something? What do I have to renounce? Here's something we could try working with. I renounce being right about the past, present, or future. I renounce being right. Because when we're attached to being right, we're inevitably going to keep recreating anger. The way out is not to deny the three poisons, but to recognize if you turn them around, you come to their opposites. Instead of greed, generosity. Instead of anger, compassion. Instead of ignorance, wisdom. Wisdom allows you to let go of a lesser pleasure for the greater pleasure of equanimity. So you, rather than chasing the pleasant or resisting the unpleasant, there's just a letting go and allowing of how it is. And that pausing, that stillness is not about stopping the mind, it's about shining a light of awareness so that we become aware of what we're thinking, what we're feeling, what's arising. Loving kindness is the antidote to hatred and ill will. It counters aversion and appreciates things just as they are. And if we can have that training of being kind to ourselves and others, even when we're making an effort to discern if anger is justified or not, this allows the mind to become gentle, more considerate. And it also dissolves the habits of thinking about or speaking to or treating others with ill will. I believe these words are from a writer named Miller Williams. Have compassion for everyone you meet, even if they don't want it. What appears bad manners and ill temper or cynicism is always a sign of things no ears have heard, no eyes have seen. You do not know what wars are going down there where the spirit meets the bone. So just sit back in your chair, relax. Allow the body to soften. Close the eyes if you'd like. And let the attention rest on the breath for a moment. Observing the breath as a way of connecting with your heart. Bring to mind an image or a sense of a person you consider who's had your best interest at heart, a benefactor, someone who has known you, cared for you. Bring this being to mind and see if it's possible to receive their wishes for your deepest well-being. You can imagine these wishes coming from their heart center through to yours, perhaps in the form of a soft shower of healing light rays, wishing you the deepest well-being. Allow these wishes to penetrate your being as you hear these phrases. May your goodness fill you. May you be safe from danger and harm. May your mind be strong and clear. May your heart be open and peaceful. Breath in, breath out. No craving present. Breath in, breath out. No hatred present. Contentment and ease with an open heart. May I find freedom from hatred and fear in my life. May I help others find freedom from hatred and fear in their lives. And may I meet hatred and fear with the courage of the open heart, which acts with decisiveness, but never divisiveness. So in closing, I'll just offer a couple of suggestions for practicing this week or inspiration. Be patient with everyone, but above all, yourself. Dipa Ma, a meditation teacher of the 20th century, said, "Free your mind. Your mind is all stories." Cultivate the spirit of blessing. If you bless those around you, this will inspire you to be attentive in every moment. And from a Tibetan monk, be grateful to everyone. 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 Don't be swayed by outer circumstances. Don't brood over the faults of others. At all times, simply rely on a joyful mind. And don't expect a standing ovation. Thank you for being here tonight, for your practice. And visit with the night sky and the moon when you leave tonight.